The Supreme Court has just handed the Trump administration a major victory, allowing the Department of Government Efficiency, better known as DOGE, to access sensitive Social Security Administration data. But this isn't just about bureaucracy, folks. We're talking about your Social Security numbers, medical records, and banking information. So grab your coffee, hit that subscribe button, and let's break down what this means for you and your privacy. Alright, let's start with the basics. Yesterday, June 6, 2025, the Supreme Court made not one, but two major rulings in favor of the Trump administration regarding DOGE, that's the Department of Government Efficiency. In a 6-3 decision, with the conservative majority overruling the three liberal justices, the court granted DOGE access to sensitive Social Security Administration data. But here's the kicker: they also ruled that DOGE doesn't have to turn over its own records under the Freedom of Information Act. Now, this all started back in March when a federal judge in Maryland, Judge Ellen Lipton Hollander, blocked DOGE from having unlimited access to Social Security data. She basically said, "Hold up, you can't just take a sledgehammer to a fly," and that's actually a direct quote from her ruling. Judge Hollander questioned why DOGE needed unlimited access to entire record systems when they hadn't even articulated a single specific reason for needing all this data. She allowed them to see anonymized data without personal identifiers, but that wasn't enough for the Trump administration. So they appealed directly to the Supreme Court. And here we are, the highest court in the land has now given DOGE the green light to access your personal information. Now, if you're wondering what exactly is DOGE, you're not alone. This whole thing has been confusing from the start. DOGE was unveiled on November 13, 2024, just 8 days after Trump's re-election. The stated mission? To dismantle government bureaucracy, slash excess regulations, cut wasteful expenditures, and restructure federal agencies. Sounds pretty ambitious, right? Initially, it was led by Elon Musk, yes, the guy who owns Tesla and SpaceX. But here's where it gets interesting. Musk and Trump had a very public falling out recently, and Musk is no longer with DOGE. Talk about drama at the highest levels of government. But here's the thing that made this whole legal battle so complex: nobody really knew what DOGE was supposed to be. Was it an advisory panel? A new government department? A private organization? The ambiguity was part of the problem. When Trump was sworn in on January 20th, he announced that DOGE would be created by reorganizing the existing U.S. Digital Service, which was actually started by Barack Obama. So we're talking about taking an existing tech initiative and turning it into this government efficiency machine. Since then, DOGE has been implementing mass layoffs across federal agencies and even trying to shut down entire entities like USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. They've also been making bold claims about cost savings and fraud detection, though many of these claims have been questioned by journalists and experts. Now let's talk about why DOGE wanted access to Social Security data in the first place. Because this is where things get really interesting and, frankly, a bit ridiculous. Early in Trump's second term, both the president and Elon Musk started making claims that Social Security was paying out benefits to millions of people who were supposedly 150 years old or older. Yes, you heard that right, 150 years old. But here's the thing: fact checkers quickly debunked this claim. The Social Security Administration actually has a code that automatically stops payments to anyone listed as alive and more than 115 years old. So what was really happening? It turns out that the Social Security system uses an old programming language called COBOL, which many government systems still rely on. When there are incomplete entries in the system, COBOL flags them with birth dates set back 150 years as a placeholder. It's basically a programming quirk, not actual 150-year-old people collecting benefits. According to a 2024 Inspector General report, less than 1% of Social Security payments are made erroneously. That's actually pretty good for a system that processes millions of payments every month. But despite these facts, Musk doubled down, calling Social Security the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time and even calling for its elimination. This is the context in which DOGE was demanding unlimited access to all Social Security data. Let's be crystal clear about what kind of data DOGE now has access to, because this isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. This is your most sensitive personal information. We're talking about Social Security numbers, which are basically the keys to your identity in America. These numbers are used for everything from opening bank accounts to getting jobs to filing taxes. If your Social Security number gets compromised, you could be looking at years of identity theft headaches. But it doesn't stop there. DOGE also now has access to medical records and banking information tied to Social Security benefits. Think about what that means: your health conditions, your financial situation, your family information, all of it potentially accessible to DOGE team members. The original judge who blocked this access, Judge Hollander, specifically cited privacy concerns. She pointed out that DOGE had never provided a specific reason for needing unlimited access to entire record systems. They just kept saying they needed to modernize the system and uncover fraud without explaining why they needed everything. That's where her famous sledgehammer to kill a fly comment came from. She was basically saying that if you want to catch fraud, you don't need to see everyone's personal information. You can use targeted, specific approaches that protect privacy. Judge Hollander's original ruling did allow DOGE to access anonymized data, meaning they could see patterns and statistics without seeing personal identifying information. But apparently, that wasn't enough for the Trump administration. So let's dive into what actually happened at the Supreme Court, because this decision is already generating a lot of controversy. The decision was 6-3, with all 6 conservative justices voting to allow DOGE access to the data, and all 3 liberal justices, Sonia Sotomayor, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and Elena Kagan, dissenting. The majority issued what's called an unsigned order, meaning they didn't write a full opinion explaining their reasoning. They just said that DOGE team members need access to the agency records in question in order for those members to do their work. But Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote what's being called a blistering dissent. She accused the majority of breaking norms to help out a presidency that doesn't want to wait for legal challenges to play out properly. Here's her most pointed criticism. Once again, this court dons its emergency responder gear, rushes to the scene, and uses its equitable power to fan the flames rather than extinguish them. Justice Jackson argued that the Trump administration hadn't proven that any irreparable harm would occur if DOGE were temporarily blocked from accessing this data. That's important because emergency Supreme Court interventions are supposed to be reserved for situations where waiting would cause serious, permanent damage. She concluded that the court was jettisoning careful judicial decision-making and creating grave privacy risks for millions of Americans in the process. But wait, there's more! The Supreme Court also made a second decision that's flying under the radar but might be just as important. In a separate case, the court ruled that DOGE itself doesn't have to turn over documents under the Freedom of Information Act, that's FOIA, the law that allows citizens and journalists to request government documents. This case was brought by Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW, a government watchdog group. They argued that since DOGE has sweeping governmental powers, it should be subject to the same transparency laws as other executive agencies. But CREW also pointed out that DOGE's deliberately ambiguous structure has kept it insulated from outside scrutiny. Nobody really knows how it operates internally, who makes decisions, or how they're making these decisions that affect millions of Americans. The Supreme Court sent this case back to a lower appeals court but with instructions to narrow any document disclosure requirements. They also said courts need to show deference and restraint regarding internal executive communications. So basically, DOGE gets to see your personal information, but you don't get to see how DOGE operates. That's a pretty one-sided transparency arrangement. The reactions to these rulings have been swift and divided, pretty much along party lines. The White House praised the decision, with spokesperson Liz Houston calling it a huge victory for the rule of law and saying it allows common-sense efforts to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. But the groups that challenge DOGE access, including the American Federation of State, County and Municipal Employees, the American Federation of Teachers, and the Alliance for Retired Americans, had a very different take. They called it a sad day for our democracy and a scary day for millions of people, arguing that the ruling will enable President Trump and DOGE affiliates to steal Americans' private and personal data. Social Security Commissioner Frank Bisignano welcomed the ruling, saying it's a major victory for American taxpayers and will help with modernization efforts. But legal experts are raising serious questions about the precedent this sets. When the Supreme Court intervenes in emergency cases like this, it's usually because there's an immediate, irreparable harm that can't wait for the normal legal process. Privacy advocates are particularly concerned about what this means for the broader principle of data protection. If the government can access your most sensitive personal information without showing a specific need, what other data might be next? So let's get to the bottom line. What does this actually mean for you, the average American? First, if you receive Social Security benefits, have ever applied for benefits, or are likely to apply in the future, your personal information is now accessible to DOGE team members. This includes your Social Security number, medical information, and financial details. The concern isn't necessarily that DOGE will misuse this information intentionally, but rather that having more people with access to sensitive data increases the risk of data breaches, leaks, or misuse. Remember, Social Security numbers are prime targets for identity thieves. The more places your number is stored and accessed, the more opportunities there are for it to be compromised. On the flip side, supporters argue that this access is necessary for genuine government efficiency efforts. They say that without seeing the actual data, it's impossible to identify problems, fraud, or inefficiencies in the system. But here's the catch: with DOGE now shielded from Freedom of Information Act requests, there's less public oversight of how they're using this access. You can't easily find out what they're doing with your information or how they're protecting it. This could also set a precedent for other government efficiency efforts. If DOGE can get unlimited access to Social Security data, what about Medicare data, IRS data, veterans benefits data? This Supreme Court decision represents a significant shift in how we balance government efficiency against individual privacy rights. The conservative majority has clearly prioritized giving the executive branch broad access to personal data in the name of fighting fraud and improving government operations. But as Justice Jackson's dissent highlights, this comes at the cost of privacy protections for millions of Americans and potentially sets a dangerous precedent for future government data access. What do you think? Are you comfortable with DOGE having access to your Social Security data if it means more efficient government? Or do you think this goes too far in sacrificing privacy for efficiency? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more coverage of Supreme Court decisions and their impact on your daily life. And if you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to know about this decision. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.